Art style is a tricky thing. It can make or break your work. Things can be elevated or dragged down by it. Making it unique is a challenge, and despite what some people say, being unique doesn't automatically make something good. You also need it to be, well, good, controversial opinions only. But it does turn an already good style into something well and truly memorable. Darkest Dungeon is one of those memorable games. Its style is influenced by a variety of things, such as works of Mike Mignola and Chris Bacalo. It draws heavily from pulp horror and medieval illustrations. It's characterized by gritty, thick lines, imperfect blotches of color, no half shadows, only full shadows, and perhaps most recognizably, no human eyes visible in their proper place. You can have gouged out human eyes, you can have monsters with eyes, but no normal human eyes are actually visible in this series. Ever. This was done by Chris Bourassa, one of the key creators of Darkest Dungeon, to illustrate that the characters have something empty or missing about them. It's a great art style. You notice right away how dark and striking it is, similar to how dark and striking majority of its inspiration sources were. Another thing you may notice is that most of that inspiration also came from media that was 2D. It was therefore incredibly reasonable, especially for a small indie company, to make a 2D game in that art style. That is not, however, how Darkest Dungeon 2 was presented. When the sequel was announced, it became clear pretty quickly that the presentation was about to change. Darkest Dungeon 2 made a switch to more of a 2.5D style of gameplay with occasional 3D. Nobody denies that it's a good-looking game in its own right, but the question I'm asking today is, was Darkest Dungeon 2 hurt by the switch to 3D? Today we'll delve a little bit deeper into different aspects of these two games in order to try and answer that question. Let's take a look at the basic loop of each game. I'm assuming most of you are somewhat familiar with the series, so I'll make it brief. In Darkest Dungeon 1, you select heroes to send on an expedition, you pick your supplies, and then you enter a level consisting of multiple corridors of varying length and structure composed of tiles and all leading to rooms. Each tile could feature either combat, a trap, a hunger check, a blockade, and most interestingly, curios. Curios can be interacted with as is for a variety of both positive and negative results that depend on the curio itself. You can also use specific items to procure a guaranteed effect, usually one that normally wouldn't be available. You then perform the mission objective, which will vary, and once you do, you can return and be rewarded with loot and experience for your heroes. In DD2, you select your heroes, you prepare them at the inn, you get to go through a level, and this is where the biggest difference, and actually the only utilization of 3D in gameplay, occurs. Instead of going through the tiles of hallways, you instead get to drive with somewhat free controls down these fairly linear paths from node to node, with some path selection here and there, and these nodes essentially replace the curios and rooms from the first game. I repeat, this is the only part of gameplay that actually utilizes the 3D aspect, and it's one of the most widely criticized parts of the game. If you've ever played it, you know what I mean, and if not, I cannot stress to you how tedious it can be. And this actually used to be way worse before the Road of Redemption update, which made the stagecoach faster and introduced different kinds of obstacles and associated stagecoach mechanics to make it just slightly less tedious. And to be fair, this is something that could theoretically be only done in 3D, except in the same update, you also lost the ability to manually make turns, instead you just press a button to select your path at the crossroads. Which of course raises the question, couldn't you achieve the same result with a 2D screen and path selection of the original? You had forks in the road back then, and you never have more than 3 choices here anyway, which was also the corridor limit in the first game. Actually, scratch that, you could go backwards in the first game, which could come in handy in a variety of situations, so you actually had more choice than you have now. Furthermore, this part of the game is definitely lacking in comparison to hallway exploration from the first game, especially since the nodes are nowhere near as varied and interesting as the curios. So the 3D aspect didn't exactly enhance the gameplay, but did the extra dimension add something to the aesthetics? Well, different people will have different opinions on the matter, but I'll try to be as fair as I can. In the original, the characters, the enemies, and the curios had a sort of pop-up book feel to them, which, combined with cartoonish proportions, really made the whole thing stand out. The sequel opted for realistic proportions, which I feel at least partially stems from the switch to 3D. The developers said that they did it to keep things fresh, but after seeing a mod that attempted to replicate the proportions of the original game for the heroes, I can see why it wouldn't work. The characters end up looking like bobbleheads. It's not very appealing. There are many who miss that original blend, though I'd be remiss not to congratulate Red Hook on the great work done with VFX and other magic tricks that really elevate the presentation here. Particles and all sorts of effects are used generously to really make everything pop. My problem is, a lot of it could be achieved in 2D as well. Not all of it maybe, but when I look at the work of a modder, Marvin Sayo, who actually worked on DD2 as a VFX artist, I find it hard to believe that a switch was necessary to pull off graphically impressive things. I mean, just look at this stuff. You could actually lean into more of a 2D style with handmade animations, think more Cuphead and Hollow Knight. This could actually recreate the little added details we've seen in the second game, like the characters prepping to use their weapons. Of course, there are things that are much easier to achieve in 3D and some that would essentially require an animation studio to pull off in 2D. So what things were gained, graphically speaking? Again, I'm sorry to say, but it seems to me there's only one. I'm not talking about behind-the-scenes processes and pipelines here. I'm not so arrogant as to claim I know exactly how Red Hook does things, but insofar as the things that the player actually sees on screen, I can think of only one. Spoilers for the final boss. This shot of the characters standing still when preparing to fight the final boss, and the camera zooms in on it from behind the heroes, and which is actually a reused animation of when they leave the inn. This is actually the only thing I can think of that really utilizes the 3D aspect for presentation. The cutscenes in Abomination's story feature some really good camera work, but nothing really that couldn't be achieved in 2D. In fact, the only other cutscenes in the game, the intro and the outro, are both 2D. And this brings us to the biggest problem with the Switch, the one that made me create this video in the first place. Making 3D assets is hard. No, seriously, it's hard. The sculpting, rigging, texturing, animating, all of that is difficult. It's also monumentally more time and resource consuming than 2D. Granted, there are some things that 3D can make easier. You don't really have to worry about staying on model, you get to effectively reuse it instead of having to draw individual frames, but bear with me for a minute. Darkest Dungeon 1 had, on launch, 10 characters. Over time, with 3 updates, that number was increased to 15, plus 2 DLC characters, each coming with a large-scale expansion for a total of 70. Darkest Dungeon 2 had 9 heroes on launch, which was increased over the years to 12 with 3 updates, plus 3 heroes between 2 DLCs. We are most likely at the point in development where we won't see any new classes added, and we're roughly in the same time frame here. Not only do we have less heroes, but when you factor in that Red Hook was just barely starting with DD1 as an independent company, and they are now well established, the burden the Switch took on development becomes apparent. Same goes for the regions. DD1 features 6 regions, including the titular dungeon itself, plus 1 mini-region available for a special event, as well as 1 mini-location for a special boss. These were added gradually over the years, with 2 of them being DLC. DD2 started with 3 regions and 2 mini-regions, one of which is reserved for the final boss, and had 1 region added and 1 mini-region sold as part of a DLC. I don't think that any of this is catastrophic. The game is still incredibly visually appealing and fun, and the driving sections are bearable, especially with the ability to set it at 50% more speed. However, the most serious drawback of all lies in the fact that this Switch single-handedly crippled the modding community. Darkest Dungeon 1 had a great modding scene. The sheer amount of custom heroes, enemies, even brand new locations is astonishing. And even though plenty of mods are of particular flavor, the fact that it's relatively easy to create 2D sprites allowed the community to flourish and to collectively expand the game in a way that doesn't take away from Red Hook, but instead complements their creation. The pinnacle of that creativity is the Black Reliquary, a total conversion mod for the game that takes place in the same world, but in a drastically different setting, putting new challenges ahead of our heroes and showing some amazing things that this game is capable of. All of that in 2D. It even features a lively animated hub in contrast to the second game's fairly static inn. Darkest Dungeon 2 has a single new hero mod, at least to my knowledge. It's the Gunslinger mod, which reskins one of the enemies and uses that model as a sort of placeholder for a character. And do not get me wrong, I am not scolding the mod developer here. They did the best they could, but the simple reality is that it's a lot more complex to create 3D assets and then put them in a game. The modding scene for DD2 is largely focused on balancing, some reskins, creating new paths for the hero path system. The community is there, and they do their best. But by making the switch to 3D, Red Hook has drastically raised the barrier of entry. We're not getting the Sunward Isles in Darkest Dungeon 2. We're not going to see an ocean of new characters, locations and enemies. And it would be fair to say that the game should be able to stand on its own without mods, and you'd be right, I'm looking at you, Bethesda. But my problem is that what was lost with this switch doesn't seem to be compensated for. The game looks great, but so did the original. The only application of the 3D aspect in gameplay is a fairly uninteresting driving mechanic that's less interesting than exploration in the original game. In terms of visuals, the 3D aspect is hardly utilized. Later in the Kingdoms mode, we got different inn models that change when we upgrade them, but you only ever see them from one angle. They might just as well be 2D sprites. Now, I'm not saying I dislike Darkest Dungeon 2. In fact, it's one of my favorite games ever made. But going forward, I think it will be wise to consider some of the issues I mentioned regardless of what path forward the developers will take. Because I love this series and I want to see it be successful. I hope you've been entertained by this video. Remember to check out my other videos. I've started a new horror series called Haunting Tales where we go through some internet horror stories. Link to that is in the pinned comment below. I'm Audioman, and I'll hear you next time.